The year was 1346, and Europe's most elite warriors were about to discover that centuries of military tradition could be shattered in a single afternoon. Picture this: 30,000 of the finest knights in Christendom, draped in gleaming armor worth more than entire villages, mounted on war horses bred for destruction, facing down a ragged army of 9,000 exhausted Englishmen who had been running for their lives across northern France. The French nobles were so confident of victory, they were literally arguing over who would get to capture the English king alive. These weren't just soldiers, they were the cream of European aristocracy, men who had trained for war since childhood, whose very existence was built around the idea that noble blood made them superior warriors. They had every conceivable advantage: overwhelming numbers, the best equipment money could buy, and 500 years of battlefield dominance backing their confidence. 4 hours later, 1,500 French nobles lay dead in the mud. The English had lost 40 men, not 400. 40. What happened that day didn't just change the course of a single battle, it obliterated an entire way of life and warfare that had dominated Europe for half a millennium. This is the story of the Battle of Crécy, where medieval knights discovered that all their training, all their expensive armor, and all their noble heritage meant absolutely nothing against a weapon that cost 10 shillings and could be mastered by any peasant willing to practice. By the end of this series, you'll understand how a simple piece of yew wood became the most feared weapon in Europe, why French knights actually murdered their own allies in the middle of battle, and how one blind king's suicidal charge became the most tragically heroic moment in military history. But to understand how this massacre unfolded, we need to go back to the beginning and examine the two armies that were about to clash in what would become one of history's most lopsided battles. Edward III of England had landed in Normandy with 15,000 men and a controversial claim to the French throne through his mother. For weeks, his army had been conducting what the medieval world called a chevauchée, essentially organized vandalism designed to prove that the French king couldn't protect his own people. They had burned their way across northern France, looting towns, destroying crops, and generally making life miserable for anyone unfortunate enough to be in their path. The English had just finished sacking the wealthy city of Caen and were desperately trying to reach the safety of English-held Calais when the French army finally caught up with them. Edward knew he was in serious trouble. His men were exhausted from weeks of raiding, low on supplies, and now faced with an enemy that outnumbered them more than 3-1. But Edward had something the French didn't understand, and certainly didn't respect: 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen. These weren't knights or nobles. They were mostly peasants, criminals, and commoners who had been practicing with their bows since childhood because English law literally required it. Every Sunday after church, every able-bodied English male had to practice archery. It was illegal to play other sports if you could be training with a bow instead. The longbow itself was deceptively simple, just a 6-foot piece of yew wood, nothing fancy or expensive about it. But in trained hands, this humble weapon was absolutely devastating. These archers could accurately place 12 arrows per minute into a target at 250 yards. That's an arrow every 5 seconds, at a distance longer than 2.5 football fields. The draw weight required was so enormous, between 150 to 180 pounds, that archaeologists can actually identify longbowmen in medieval graves by their deformed skeletons. Years of drawing these massive bows had left their left arms inches longer than their right, their shoulder blades twisted, their spines curved from the constant strain of pulling weights that would challenge modern weightlifters. Meanwhile, Philip VI of France had assembled what was arguably the largest and most impressive army in medieval Europe: 30,000 to 35,000 men, including 12,000 heavy cavalry, knights in full-plate armor mounted on armored war horses. These weren't just any soldiers. This was literally every important noble in France, plus allied kings and princes from across Europe, who had come to join what they saw as an easy victory over an outnumbered English army. The Holy Roman Empire had sent troops. The King of Bohemia had arrived with his entire court, despite being completely blind. Majorca had contributed knights. It was like a medieval all-star team, and every single one of them wanted English blood. These French knights were the absolute pinnacle of medieval military technology. A fully armoured knight on an armoured horse represented about a ton of steel, muscle, and aristocratic fury thundering across the battlefield. They had been bred for war since birth, trained in combat from the moment they could hold a sword. Their armour alone cost more than most peasant villages earned in an entire lifetime. For 5 centuries, these heavy cavalry charges had been the decisive factor in European warfare. Infantry existed to be trampled. Archers were considered minor annoyances at best. Real warriors, noble warriors, fought with steel and courage, not with peasant weapons fired from a safe distance. Edward III understood that was facing certain doom almost. His army was outnumbered, exhausted, and trapped with their backs to enemy territory. But he also understood something that the French nobility had failed to grasp. The nature of warfare itself was changing, and those who refused to adapt would be destroyed by those who embraced new realities. When Edward chose his position near the village of Crécy, he selected a hill that would force the French to attack uphill through muddy ground. He arranged his army in 3 divisions with his archers forming a V shape between them, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn the battlefield into a killing zone. Then Edward made a decision that shocked both armies and would echo through military history. He ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot alongside the common soldiers. English nobles, men who had spent their entire lives training for the thunderous charge of heavy cavalry, were commanded to step down from their war horses and stand in the mud like common infantry. This wasn't just a tactical decision, it was a revolutionary moment that challenged centuries of military tradition and social hierarchy. The idea of nobles fighting like peasants was almost incomprehensible to the medieval mind. But Edward understood that survival mattered more than tradition, and slowly his knights began taking their places in the line, their polished plate armour gleaming beside the simple wool hoods of the archers. The contrast between the 2 armies on the evening before battle couldn't have been more stark. The English camp was quiet and disciplined. Archers carefully prepared their yew bows, rubbing beeswax into the strings to keep them waterproof. Stakes were hammered into the earth under cover of darkness. Ditches were dug by torchlight to break up cavalry charges. Every detail reflected careful planning and grim determination. Chronicles record that Edward even distributed meat and ale to his men so they could sleep with full stomachs, while the massive army Saint French aggered into their camp a Gru afterling force to catch, organised from march, hungry, and there rush the retreating English. Meanwhile, the French camp was pure chaos disguised as pageantry. Nobles paraded past each other in magnificent armour that caught the dying light, their banners snapping in the wind like the wings of exotic birds. Each lord seemed more resplendent than the last, their heraldry a rainbow of pride stretched across silk and steel. But beneath this dazzling display lay a fundamental problem that would prove fatal within hours. These weren't soldiers under a unified command. These were aristocrats, each one accustomed to being the most important person in their own domain, each one convinced that their personal glory mattered more than collective victory. Dukes argued with counts over who would lead the first charge. Princes debated which of them deserved the honour of personally capturing Edward alive for ransom. The very idea of coordinated tactics was drowning in a sea of competing egos. Philip VI tried desperately to maintain some semblance of order, but his voice was lost in the clamour of trumpets, the neighing of war horses, and the constant boasting of nobles who saw this battle not as a military operation, but as the greatest tournament of their lives. They had transformed warfare into entertainment, and tomorrow they would pay the ultimate price for their arrogance. As dawn broke on August 26th, they'd to march French vanguard through the smoking ruins of Edward's chevauchée. Villages still smouldered like funeral pyres. Crops lay blackened in the fields. Livestock wandered aimlessly through the devastation. Peasants watched from the ruins of their homes as thousands of armoured knights thundered past, their whispered curses following the army like a dark wind. To the French nobility, this destruction was a humiliation that demanded immediate and terrible vengeance. To the English, it was proof that their strategy of devastation was working perfectly. They had turned the very landscape into a weapon, and now that weapon was about to claim its victims. Philip's army reached Crécy around 4 in the afternoon, their horses lathered with sweat from the forced march, the men exhausted from pursuing the English across northern France. Any competent commander would have ordered his troops to rest, to prepare proper battle plans, to attack fresh in the morning when they could coordinate their assault. Philip actually did order a halt, recognizing the wisdom of patience. But patience was not a virtue that French nobility possessed in abundance. They could see the English on that hill, outnumbered and apparently trapped, and they could smell glory hanging in the air like incense. Every noble wanted to be the hero of the day, the man whose courage would be sung about in ballads for generations to come. The king's orders dissolved like sugar in rain as individual lords began making their own decisions about when and how to attack. The afternoon sky began to darken with storm clouds, and soon a brief but violent rainstorm soaked the battlefield. The French knights laughed as rain bounced off their expensive plate armor, confident that a little water couldn't possibly affect the outcome of what they saw as an inevitable victory. But that rain meant something entirely different to the missile troops on both sides. The English archers calmly unstrung their bows and tucked the strings safely under their helmets and leather cloaks, protecting them from the moisture that would render them useless. This was knowledge passed down through generations of English archery tradition, a simple precaution that separated professionals from amateurs. The Genoese crossbowmen, who made up the French missile troops, had no such foresight. Their bowstrings absorbed the rainwater, stretching and sagging until they became practically worthless. The effective range of their weapons dropped dramatically, and their rate of fire slowed to a crawl. This seemingly minor detail would soon determine the fate of thousands. When the rain stopped and Philip finally arrived at the battlefield, he could see the English army arranged on the hill in perfect formation. Their banners fluttered in the breeze, their lines were tight and disciplined, and everything about their position screamed careful preparation. The king ordered his army to wait until the following morning, recognizing that attacking an prepared enemy position with tired troops was a recipe for disaster. But behind him, the flower of French chivalry was already surging forward like water through a broken dam. Counts and dukes shouted that the day was wasting, that glory was slipping through their fingers with every passing moment. Some had already lowered their lances and spurred their horses toward the enemy. The careful chain of command that held armies together snapped like a rotten rope. The French army was no longer an army at all. It had become a mob of impatient aristocrats who refused to let discipline interfere with their personal pursuit of fame and honor. They had transformed a military operation into a race for individual glory, and that transformation would cost them everything. The Battle of Crécy began not with trumpets and coordinated charges, but with pride exploding out of control like a powder keg touched by flame. The French vanguard ignored their king's explicit orders and began advancing toward the English position, each wave of nobles pushing forward because they refused to be left behind, while others claimed the victory they believed belonged to them. First came the Genoese crossbowmen, about 5,000 of the finest mercenary missile troops that money could buy. These were professionals who had fought in wars across Europe, men who understood their craft and normally executed it with deadly precision. But today, everything that could go wrong was about to go wrong. Their pavises, the large wooden shields they normally hid behind while reloading their crossbows, were still miles away with the baggage train. The recent rainstorm had left their bowstrings soggy and unreliable. They would have to advance across open ground without cover, using weapons that had been compromised by the weather, against an enemy that had prepared for exactly this moment. The Genoese advanced to within about 150 yards of the English line and released their first volley. Most of their bolts fell short, thudding harmlessly into the muddy slope or skittering uselessly across the wet grass. They had announced their presence and revealed their weakness in a single, futile gesture. Then the English responded with a sound that witnesses would describe as resembling thunder rolling across the hills of northern France. 5,000 longbows released simultaneously, their strings singing a death song that had never been heard before on any battlefield in Europe. The sky literally darkened as 60,000 arrows arced through the air, blotting out what remained of the afternoon sun like a swarm of wooden locusts descending upon the earth below. Each English archer was loosing 12 arrows per minute with mechanical precision, their movements as synchronized as a deadly ballet performed by men who had practiced this dance since childhood. The sound was unlike anything the medieval world had ever experienced, not the clash of steel on steel or the thunder of charging horses, but something entirely new and terrifying. It was the sound of mathematics made manifest, of discipline defeating chaos, of common men wielding power that kings had never imagined possible. The arrows fell upon the Genoese like a biblical plague. These weren't the crude missiles that medieval armies were accustomed to. These were bodkin points forged specifically to punch through armor, fired with enough force to drive through mail and into flesh, bone, and vital organs. The mercenaries had no shields to hide behind. Their crossbows took 30 seconds to reload compared to 5 seconds for a longbow, and they were standing in the open like targets at an archery contest. Within minutes, the Genoese formation disintegrated. Men who had fought across Europe for decades were falling by the dozens, their professional discipline shattered by the sheer volume of death raining down upon them. Those who survived the first volleys broke ranks and began streaming back toward the French lines, abandoning their expensive crossbows and running for their lives across the muddy field. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals something truly horrifying about the nature of medieval nobility and their understanding of warfare. The Count of Alençon, watching the Genoese retreat, made a decision that would echo through military history as one of the most callously stupid moments ever recorded on a battlefield. "Kill this rabble that blocks our way," he shouted, and French knights actually began charging into their own crossbowmen, cutting them down with swords and trampling them under their war horses. They literally murdered their own mercenaries for the crime of retreating from an impossible situation. The Genoese found themselves caught between English arrows and French steel, dying at the hands of both their enemies and their employers. This wasn't just military incompetence, it was a perfect example of how aristocratic arrogance had completely divorced the French nobility from military reality. They saw the retreat of the crossbowmen not as a tactical withdrawal from an untenable position, but as cowardice that insulted their honor and blocked their path to glory. They were so eager to reach the English that they were willing to slaughter their own troops to clear the way. Now came the main event that every French noble had been anticipating. 12,000 mounted knights charging uphill through mud, over the bodies of dead Genoese, straight into the concentrated firepower of 5,000 English longbowmen. This was the moment when medieval warfare was supposed to reach its glorious climax, when noble blood and expensive armor and centuries of military tradition would prove their superiority over common archers. What actually happened was a systematic destruction of everything the medieval world believed about combat and social hierarchy. The longbow arrows that met when the French charge it just pieces of wood with metal points. They were instruments of social revolution, each one carrying the power to shatter assumptions that had defined European civilization for centuries. At longer ranges, the arrows might not penetrate the finest plate armor directly, but they didn't need to. They struck the horses, finding gaps in armor around the eyes, mouths, and legs of animals that couldn't be completely protected. A 1,500-pound war horse hit by multiple arrows doesn't continue charging. It screams, rears up in agony, falls sideways, or simply collapses into a thrashing obstacle that destroys the momentum of the entire charge. Knights behind the fallen horses crashed into the sudden barriers, their carefully coordinated assault dissolving into chaos as riders found themselves trapped behind mountains of dying horseflesh. The charge that was supposed to sweep the English from the field instead became a traffic jam of aristocratic fury, with nobles fighting each other just to reach the enemy. At closer ranges, under 100 yards, the bodkin points could punch through even the finest armor at vulnerable spots. They went through visors into faces, through gaps in plate armor, into armpits and groins, through the joints where even the best armor had to allow for movement. But even the arrows that didn't penetrate were devastating in their own way. The impact of a longbow arrow hitting plate armor was like being struck with a sledgehammer. Multiple hits rattled knights inside their expensive shells like dice in a cup, stunning them, breaking bones and leaving them helpless, even if the arrows didn't draw blood. The armor that was supposed to make them invincible had become a trap that turned them into stationary targets. But the arrows were only part of the English defensive system. The battlefield that Edward had so carefully prepared now revealed its deadly purpose. Horses hit the hidden ditches that had been dug during the night and broke their legs instantly. Knights crashed into sharpened stakes that had been driven into the ground at angles designed to impale charging cavalry. The recent rain had turned the slope into a slippery nightmare where dismounted knights in 60 pounds of armor could barely move, let alone fight effectively. The French came forward in waves, each one climbing over the bodies of the previous assault, and each one meeting the same fate. Contemporary accounts describe the arrows falling like snow, so thick that charging knights couldn't see through the deadly blizzard to identify targets or coordinate their attacks. The English archers had prepared for this moment by sticking arrows point first into the ground in front of their positions for quick access, allowing them to maintain continuous fire without pause. And here's a detail that perfectly captures both the horror and the efficiency of what was happening. The English archers ran out of arrows multiple times during the battle. You know what they did? They sprinted forward into the field of dead and dying French knights, pulled arrows out of corpses and wounded men, and fired them back at the next wave of attackers. The French nobility was literally being killed with their own recycled suffering. The psychological impact of this slaughter was perhaps more devastating than the physical casualties. For even 500 years, European nobility had based their entire identity on the idea that they were naturally superior warriors. Their noble blood, blessed by God, made them better at combat than any commoner could ever hope to be. The feudal system itself was built on this assumption. Nobles ruled because they were the warrior class, the protectors, the men whose courage and skill in battle justified their power over peasants. Crécy destroyed this fundamental assumption in the most brutal way possible. Welsh peasants with bent sticks and pieces of string were systematically destroying the finest knights in Christendom, and they were doing it with the calm efficiency of craftsmen practicing their trade. There was nothing glorious or heroic about it from the French perspective. It was simply industrial-scale killing that reduced proud knights to anonymous corpses in the mud. The battle continued for hours, wave after wave of French nobility throwing themselves into the meat grinder with increasing desperation and decreasing organization. French nobles were literally fighting each other to get to the front of each charge, each one convinced that his would somehow personal courage succeed where others had failed. Each one determined not to be left out of what they still believed would be their moment of glory. By the time darkness began to fall, 16 separate charges had been launched against the English position. 16 times the flower of French chivalry had thundered up that hill. 16 times they had been cut down like wheat before the scythe. The sacred oriflamme, the battle banner of France that was supposed to guarantee victory, lay abandoned in the mud among thousands of noble corpses. Philip VI himself had joined the final charge, his royal presence doing nothing to change the mathematics of the slaughter. His horse was killed beneath him, an arrow went through his jaw, and his personal guard had to physically drag their wounded king from the battlefield as he tried to return to the fighting. The man who ruled the most powerful kingdom in Europe had been reduced to just another target for English arrows. As the last flighted from the sky, the English couldn't quite have accomplished what they'd. They remained in their positions throughout the night, killing any wounded French knights who showed signs of movement, using knives and ham their waters and sharpened stakes to finish arrows had started. English peasant archers were literally beating French princes to death with clubs, a sight that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. When dawn broke on August 27th, the true scale of the catastrophe became clear. The cream of French nobility lay scattered across the muddy slope like discarded toys. The Count of Flanders, the Count of Blois, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Auxerre, the list of dead nobles read like a directory of European aristocracy. 1,500 knights and nobles had perished, including 11 princes and counts whose deaths would reshape the political map of medieval Europe. The English losses stood at approximately 40 men dead, including only 2 knights. The mathematical impossibility of this ratio, 1 English knight dead for every 750 French nobles, was so extreme that even contemporary chroniclers struggled to believe their own records. Some claimed divine intervention, others suspected that the numbers had been exaggerated for propaganda purposes. But the reality was simpler and more revolutionary than supernatural intervention. The longbow had made heavy cavalry obsolete in a single afternoon, and the social implications of this technological shift would echo through European civilization for centuries to come. The aftermath of Crécy was as devastating psychologically as it was militarily. This wasn't just a battlefield defeat. It was the complete shattering of everything medieval Europe believed about warfare, nobility, and the natural order of society. The longbow had proven that a Welsh peasant who practiced archery after Sunday church could kill a French duke just as easily as he could kill a common soldier. Noble blood offered no protection against mathematics. The immediate consequences were grotesque beyond imagination. So many high-ranking nobles had died that there weren't enough people of appropriate social status to properly bury them according to medieval custom. Bodies of princes and counts lay rotting in the mud for days, while survivors tried to figure out the complex protocols of aristocratic funeral rites. Meanwhile, local peasants crept onto the battlefield, under cover of darkness, to loot corpses that contained more wealth than their villagers had ever seen. The scavenging became a feeding frenzy that lasted for weeks. Crows and wolves gorged themselves on noble flesh until they could barely move, hopping from corpse to corpse too bloated to fly or run. Local farmers reported that the carrion birds grew fat on Prince Solie meat, that they would simply waddle between bodies, their beaks dripping with the blood of men who had once commanded armies. For the English army, the victory was so complete, it felt surreal. These archers, who had grown up as criminals, poachers, and outcasts, were suddenly the most feared warriors in Europe. Men who had been whipped for stealing chickens had just destroyed the military elite of the most powerful kingdom in Christendom, using weapons they had crafted themselves from trees in English forests. But Edward's army couldn't celebrate for long. They were still deep in enemy territory, still outnumbered by the remaining French forces, still desperately trying to reach the safety of English-held Calais. The battle had bought them survival, but not security. They continued their march through northern France, leaving behind a field so thick with noble corpses that locals renamed it the Field of the Cloth of Gold, for all the expensive silk and embroidered heraldry adorning the dead. And so, on that muddy slope near a forgotten French village, the medieval world died in an afternoon. 5 centuries of military tradition, the entire concept of noble warrior supremacy, the romance of knightly combat, all of it destroyed by peasants with bent wood and bowstring. The longbow had proven that courage couldn't defeat mathematics, that expensive armor couldn't stop disciplined firepower, and that the age of the mounted knight was ending not with honor, but with arrows through the face. Crécy didn't just change warfare, it shattered the very foundations upon which European society had been built, one deadly accurate shot at a time.